Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Well, very good.
Good.
Want to talk about the internet. Have you heard that there's people who are trying to kick people off Twitter and Facebook?
No.
Of course, we've talked about it for a while because they've been managing us as a group, you know, on Facebook and different things that we can and can't do. Everybody knows about that. Sometimes they even go after individuals when they really are cutting into the power of the government. Sometimes they come in and they take one individual off, but I don't know any of those people that happened.
They're bad guys.
So, but anyway, it's an interesting subject because it's a mess out there. There's no doubt there's censorship on what we do. We know it. The question is who has a right to censor? Does the government have a right? Most people would agree that the government shouldn't be the censor. But then again, there's people now with this mess that we have, and even among libertarians, that we don't have one concrete answer and say, this is what we need to do, because it isn't like you and I owning a private corporation and they have a right, you know, nobody should have a right to come if we haven't, committed some type of fraud or violent act or something. But nobody has a right to censor us. So, but now this is big. This is social media. It's huge. It's been beneficial to a lot. It's been socially, it's been fantastic for a lot of people providing a service. But then when it comes, how did it get started? Who did it? Was the government involved? Is the government involved now? Do they participate in government? So it's not quite like a private company being regulated. But of course, it's not brand new either. You know, when radios came in, the first thing they did was had radio licensing, it's TV licensing. So there's always been this tone that the government has some responsibility, and in a way they held people in check. And then they come along and they have these hate laws and different things to monitor hate speech, and that gets involved. But now we have this mess where all of a sudden it seems like they're much more aggressive against the people like us who would like to expose the mistakes made by government. And we are so determined, and some people would say so foolish, to fight for the cause of saying that the First Amendment tells us that one of the most important parts of the First Amendment is our right and duty to criticize our government. It used to be considered patriotic to be able to do that. But now, in collusion, it looks like there is collusion, you know, between our government and social media in order to punish the people that's criticizing the government. So it's a mess. And today I would like to go not so much to dwell on the mess. We certainly can mention that, but I want to see what kind of thinking we have on the people who have made some proposals, some that we can agree with and some we might challenge.
Yeah, and as is usual, government loves this kind of chaos. You're right, it's chaos. It's seemingly intractable. We don't know there's not an absolute libertarian solution. It's a difficult thing. This kind of chaos is like fertilizer for the government. And so one of the things that sparked our interest this morning was a piece we saw on Reason, the Reason website. Senator Warner, Virginia, an authoritarian to be sure. He's a big shot on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He had his staff to put together here's a solution for this social media problem. You're never going to believe it. We need to take it over. Here's the name of their white paper that they produced that was leaked recently. Potential Policy Proposals for Regulation of Social Media and Technology Firms. Just the title sounds awful.
Well, if I had a chance to have a visit with him and he was open-minded, I would suggest that it shouldn't be that complicated, and it should have applied way back because there's been issues like this throughout our history. But I would say that we should look to what the founders thought about it, and of course, they wrote the Constitution, then they went back and decided, well, we have to be explicit on protecting particular rights, and of course they wrote the First Amendment to protect these personal ability to express ourselves in the press and the media and this sort of thing. But I like the first 3 or 4 words of the First Amendment. Congress shall write no law.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that is it. That does not mean that you can lie and that you can slander and be fraudulent and excite people to violence. But it was not to be taken care of by the federal government. Freedom of expression and what you did with newspapers and whatever was always implied that that would be something else, handled by something else. But they have gone a long way from the Congress shall write no law. Matter of fact, that was the theme in many ways of the whole Constitution. You can't do it unless it was authorized. And then they had the whole 10th Amendment was, in a way, the Congress shall write no laws dealing with these things that the founders wanted to protect. So I would suggest that we got off tangent at the very beginning, especially how the social media came about, how the internet came about. Government was very much involved, and they're more involved now than ever. And since there's so much dissent and anger and hostility and hatred toward Trump and failure of policy and deception going on, it seems like the fight is getting more vicious. And under those circumstances, you have to silence not the people who have a certain view, but people who are telling the truth. Sometimes the truth hurts and they don't like it. But that is certainly what I see here coming now, is try to silence the people. We haven't had many people who have been promoting big government, Republicans or Democrats, because they both promote big government. You don't see that. But there were some people that said that even if you mentioned the Federal Reserve, it would call attention, to the people who are, watching. Yeah. So all kinds of things that tip them off to look and say, well, we have to restrain this individual or this organization. So it is challenging. It's not brand new. It's been around, but it's probably accelerating, and it's probably much more serious. And we have to sort of talk a little bit about what some of these solutions have been proposed.
Yeah, and certainly I would say Senator Warner's paper, from reading it and reading about it, is 100% terrible. And here's what they're talking about. Here's what they're setting out to solve. The government wants to solve. The Senate wants to solve for us. They want to combat disinformation. That's censorship. They want to protect our privacy better, and they want to promote competition in the tech space. And you could see someone looking at that on the surface saying, okay, well, that sounds probably okay. For us, knowing how government works, those are all bad. But here's how they want to do it. Here's some of the solutions that they propose in the white paper. New federal funding for media literacy programs. That's a great idea, right? But also more resources to military intelligence to prepare for foreign information operations. The second one is equally horrible, requiring web platforms to label bot accounts and to do more to verify users. Well, as we know, they get it wrong constantly. There were several very prominent Twitter users that were incorrectly labeled as bots and suffered. One of them is a very prominent critic of U.S. foreign policy in Syria. She happens to be a chemist and a very prominent person. She was labeled a bot. She's not. So they get it wrong. So what happens if they get it wrong? Will the government indemnify these companies if they wrongly accuse someone of being a bot? And do more to verify that they're actually people. Don't we have a right to privacy? Can I go on Twitter as Joe Blow without the government coming in and saying, hey, you're not that? And the last one is mandatory location verification. That seems like a godsend to government. Not that they can't find out anyway where we are, but we have to tell them where we are at all times, who we are, verifying it. It's just a nightmare.
Well, that means more regulations, and people will be tempted to accept this. But the whole problem is who's going to run it? Some people suggest, well, run it like a public utility. They have to follow the regulations. But who writes the regulations? It's back to it. But I think there was too much government in the beginning, and we have to restrain the government. We have to legalize competition. But the big question is how does a libertarian address the subject of, well, this is a corporation. We know if it's a private corporation, we don't assume the authority that we can tell them what they can publish unless they're slandering people and causing harm that way. So we would say we don't want to do that. But there has to be a way. I think maybe there should be limits on what about maybe we could use false advertisement. What if they advertise and contractually say, well, and I think a few companies have said that, we won't turn your information to anybody. What about a law that restrains the government and says the government cannot participate in any way with these organizations? They cannot accept any information unless they have the real proper search warrant. You know, and that would be restraining the government in doing this. But if somebody gets on there, and I think there's probably a limit to an incitement to violence. If you're trying to get the marching orders out there, get your guns, we're all going to meet here and we're going to take over something. There's probably some limits there too. But this whole idea of opening up Pandora's box and having another agency of government that's going to micromanage what people say, I think that would be a total disaster.
And that's exactly what the government wants. The problem is that these companies, and you've said it many times, these companies are too close to the government. Not that they're going to say, please regulate me. This is what all the big companies do. The problem is that they're already too close to government. And I mentioned this on an extra show we did yesterday, but the government, it's a perfect marriage because they both want to limit the range of debate. The government doesn't want people questioning the government, and the social media doesn't want that too because they're doing the bidding of the government. So if they're in bed together, the last thing you want to do is give the government more power because it's a symbiosis.
Yeah, they've been pretty shrewd, especially a group like Facebook, because they do provide a service. And it's interesting and enjoyment, and people use it. And they like it. And if they hear only us saying, well, we have to watch what they do and say, and we're challenging them, this will make a lot of people very nervous because they sort of, the culture is the government's there to protect us. So the government will be okay. They protect our consumer products, and they protect it at the airports and make sure that we're always safe. So they'll take care of it. They might just say, this is the role of government. And now these generations, and maybe a couple generations now, have grown up with this attitude that that's the job of the government to protect us. So they may just roll over and say this is pretty good. So I think the mess that we have is a reflection of people's attitudes about government, thinking government, will protect us and take care of us. And they don't see this as a threat. They either don't care or pay much attention to it, or they're apathetic about it, and they just let it go. But we still have to deal with the problem. What are we going to do about it? If it gets worse and they come in and close down our websites and things like that, and we can't use the social media, what are we going to do? And I keep thinking that somebody a lot smarter than me that know about internets and computers, that there's technology out there. Why can't we have our own system? I often thought, well, there always will be one because libertarians love, technology and computers, but we haven't had anybody step forward and compete. Matter of fact, some of them seem to be associated with the government. And of course, to me, what that symbolizes is a more fascist understanding, corporatist understanding. These companies, the social media companies were started, and the internet was started with the use of government. And then they're in bed with government in enforcing law and speeches and what they're doing. And that's that combination that is to be watched carefully. And that is the association of big government and big corporations. And I think this is very symbolic of an extreme association. And libertarians right now are in a bit of a box on what to do with this, because I don't think too many could accomplish saying, well, they're to work too close to government, so we're going to close down ABC. Well, they're not going to do it. It wouldn't work, and it wouldn't be the real answer. But competition is what I think we need. I think over the years, radio did pretty well, in competing. There's a lot of radio stations. Even today, a lot of people are out there in small radios. There are some people who specialize in advertisement, just a small radio station around. So there is competition. Even, there are some cable stations. Sometimes they're not even identified with the United States, are pretty good. So the technology is there. I hope there can be an answer found in that, where we can get together and come up with a technological solution.
And you mentioned the collusion between government and these companies. I think one of the big problems is we have to remember who we are. We have to remember what America is about. We have to be actual patriots. Peter Van Buren, we did a special episode of the Liberty Report yesterday afternoon on this issue of Twitter, the Twitter bannings. And Peter mentioned, and I hadn't known this, but Google is working with the Chinese government to develop a special search engine that will never pull up sites that the Chinese government considers antisocial. So they're working hand in glove with the Chinese government to make a censored Google. And that seems to be what people are calling for here in the U.S. We need to understand that we're not here to China bash, but we don't want to be that. Our society wasn't founded on that concept that we need the government to protect us from searching things. So we need to do our own soul searching and figure out who we are.
Yeah, and in a way, there's been a lot of talk, and Facebook's been in the news, and they've been knocked down a notch or two because they may well have overstepped their bounds, but then people aren't using it as much. And our friend Scott Horton said, I'm quitting. I'm not going to use Twitter anymore. There's a lot of other people that want to. I kept wondering, see what you think of this suggestion to really bring this to a head and get people to understand it. People who are apathetic. I think to really test all this, I think Twitter should ban Trump.
Oh.
They should ban him because he says a lot of controversial things, and he's stirring up trouble, and there's a lot of hatred out there. It's not the liberal media that causing it, it's all Trump. So if he were banned, I think maybe the debate would become a healthy debate, but maybe it would backfire and lead to more violence, because there'd be a lot of people. But no, they can't do that, because it just would be overstepping the bounds, and they're overstepping the bounds too. But I just hope we can organize people and get help from people who have the technology and maybe the finances to help put something together where we can compete with that social network.
Yeah, exactly. That's quite a modest proposal on your part. The other thing Peter said, Peter is now in the news because he was banned from Twitter for something that was absolutely ridiculous, and we went over it on yesterday's show if someone wants to look it up. But Peter made the good point that Americans need to grow up too. If you don't like what Peter is writing on Twitter, you can block him, you can unfollow him, you can mute him. You don't have to read a single word he writes. So why is everyone whining about banning him? Get rid of him. We can't even have him in the public debates. It's really something that we need to look to ourselves for some of these problems. It's very disconcerting. And on Scott, a final thing, and then I'll do a final closing. Scott did something on the show too, which is interesting in our conclusion. He said there's got to be some technology out there that doesn't require us to have a central website that we go to for social media. We all create our own social medias and our own algorithms and determine who is in our circles and who isn't without this gatekeeper called Twitter and Facebook and what have you. And that way we're also not making them rich necessarily. So there is technology. I'm sure, I'm not an expert, but there is some out there that certainly, hopefully the future will move in that direction rather than the let's become China direction.
And Daniel, that would fit into the private property ownership thing. We censor people all the time in private property. We censor and control who comes into our house. This would be our business house, and we would be able to say that, yes, you guys are over the top. You're expressing not necessarily a violent view, but you're expressing a view that is contrary to freedom.
Yeah.
And you're advocating big government, so we should censor them and not allow them on. So I think it's a great idea. The technology, from my understanding, shouldn't be that complex. Let's hope that works out.
And there are people like Kim.com who's very good on these things. He's supposedly working on an alternative to Twitter, so hopefully he's got that in mind with what he's doing. But I would close by actually announcing that a lot of you may have read in the media yesterday that both Scott Horton and I, in addition to Peter Van Buren, were suspended from Twitter. Scott and I, because we retweeted an objection to Peter being banned for simply engaging with mainstream journalists in a heated debate. I received a notice this morning from Twitter after I appealed it saying, we regret any inconvenience. Your suspension was in error and you have been reinstated. I still have not decided what I'm going to do now. I still believe that Peter Van Buren, who's at We Meant Well on Twitter, must be reinstated. They cannot, in my opinion, they should not silence a voice as important as Peter's I'm still thinking about what I'm going to do. But I urge the rest of you who are concerned about an open debate, and forget about government versus corporation, an open debate among adults who can think for themselves, to encourage Twitter to get rid of the suspension, get rid of the ban, or whatever they want to call it, the termination, I think is the word they used, of Peter Van Buren. Bring all of his tweets back. Let us decide for ourselves if we want to follow him or not.
Very good. And you know, when you mention this, you're back on, but how are they going to take care of the possible damage to your reputation? Yeah. And I thought, well, if you were looking for that, that might not work so well, because it may be that your reputation has skyrocketed now because you're standing with the good guys and you'll have to pay them for doing this for you.
Yeah, really.
So, also, there was one suggestion which doesn't make any sense. That they said planners in Washington, they want to have another Bill of Rights. They want to rewrite a Bill of Rights for the social media. This is what you can do and can't do. And I would suggest not necessary. We have a Bill of Rights. There were some studies the other day, the people going around and talking to college kids about the First Amendment rights. And they said, is that the one that gives us the right to own a gun? You know, it was just way over the top. We need somebody to bring up another generation of individuals. Unless they go to homeschool or private schooling, it's not likely to happen. But we don't need a new Bill of Rights. We have one. We need to enforce it. But most important, we have to have an understanding of what personal liberty is all about, and we have to be willing to defend it intellectually, emotionally, so that we're not over the top, and present it in a fashion where people say, you know, it makes a lot of sense. And besides, what we have now, we're witnessing the failure of a system, an economic, social failure, a foreign policy failure, and we have to reassess ourselves. And America was on the right track at one time, but believe me, America is not on the right track right now, and I think that reassessment is in order, and the difficulty is very, very slim. It's not that hard to figure out what we should do. We got a good start, then we abandoned that about 100 years ago, so we need to restate the principles, understand these principles, and pass that on, and have a social type of revolution where people care about their liberty and they are not complacent and figure, well, it is the government's responsibility to make me safe and make sure I don't read anything I shouldn't be reading, and make sure they take care of me so that I'm safe on airplanes, and make sure the Russians don't invade next week. I'll tell you what, I don't think it's that difficult. We just need some people in our camp that can express these views, and hopefully we'll move in the other direction, move back toward a society that respects liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.